kind of go like this. The first part is sort of reasonably comprehensible on a fairly normal level, and then we go down into some very kind of deep and complex material, and then we kind of come out again and we return to the level of reasonably comprehensible. So that's how it'll go. I'll signal how we're doing with those three parts, and I'll try to sort of go as slowly as possible on the bits that are more difficult, which kind of involve going into some detail of Kant's philosophy, which for some people may not be familiar. So, Kant's answer to the question of determination, which is the question of how things are determined to be what they are, defines transcendental idealism and forms the core of Deleuze's lifelong fascination with Kant. Deleuze criticizes Kant for reducing determination to the external application of concepts to the given. But what really preoccupies Deleuze is a deeper account of determination in Kant, the determination of the being of the self by its own thinking activity. Our own determinable being is precisely what is to be thought, that is, what is to be determined, but it is not thought, and it cannot be thought, since the only thing that can be thought is the being that is determined. I am going to go over that in more detail later on. The two elements here are made different by the time it takes to do the determining. And what fascinates Deleuze about Kant is that the very act in which the I thinks its own being requires that being to squirm out of thought's reach. Through its thinking activity, the I generates difference from its being, indicating that the being of thought is both what must be thought and what cannot be thought. So the difference of thought from its being recurs throughout Deleuze's writings on Kant. The significance of this motif can be seen in the first quote on your handout, which is from What is Philosophy, where Deleuze links this attempt to think the being of thought with thinking the plane of immanence. So he says, perhaps this is the supreme act of philosophy, not so much to think the plane of immanence as to show that it is there, unthought in every plane, and to think it in this way as the outside and inside of thought, as the not external outside and the not internal inside, that which cannot be thought and yet must be thought, which was thought once, as Christ was incarnated once, in order to show that one time the possibility of the impossible. Thus, Spinoza is the Christ of philosophers, and the greatest philosophers are hardly more than apostles who distance themselves from or draw near to this mystery. So Deleuze appears here as an apostle among apostles, attempting to draw ever nearer to the mystery of thought that thinks its own being. This activity both makes possible and relies on the difference of being and thought. Thought generates its own differing from itself, its own unthought or outside, that is nevertheless internal to it, as if thought was worked over from the inside by something it cannot think, to quote another of Deleuze's texts. With respect to the discovery of this specific problem, that is, the problem of how thought is to think its own being, Kant is second only to Spinoza in Deleuze's estimation. And this means we can't reduce the relationship between Deleuze and Kant to one of mere rivalry or criticism, but we should instead see Kant as Deleuze's co-apostle, trying to reveal the same mystery. So in this paper, I'm going to show how Deleuze upholds Kant's recognition of the difference of being and thought as an internally determining and ontologically productive difference. It is because of this discovery that Deleuze criticizes Kant's tendency to conceal difference and to make determination an external, merely epistemic procedure. Kant discovers the differing of thought from its own being, but covers over this internal difference with the identity of the subject, leading him to affirm only the external separation of conceptual thought from the being of the given. So a pure, productive internal difference is suppressed in favor of a restrictive external separation reliant on a self-identical subject. So in the first section, we're going to look at Kant's repression of difference and Deleuze's criticism of it. In the second section, the more difficult one, we're going to look in more detail at Kant's discovery of the difference of being and thought and what Deleuze finds productive in it. And in the third section, we'll return to what is philosophy to see how Deleuze connects this difference to his thinking of the plane of immanence and what philosophy is. So, the first section begins now. Kant's critique of pure reason aims, among other things, to destabilize the rationalist assumption that thought is necessarily adequate to being. For the rationalist, to be is to be conceived in a complete concept by God's infinite intellect, and to be thus conceived is to be brought into being. Rationalism thereby provides a unified account of the genesis of beings, and at the same time of their determination to be what they specifically are. Now, fundamental to Kant's transcendental idealism, by contrast, is the denial of the intelligibility of the genesis and complete determination of beings. That is what Kant's project is all about, to say that that process is simply not intelligible to the human mind. The finite thought of human minds are not only inadequate to being, they cannot even be certain that there is an infinite intellect that would generate, determine, and know being adequately. The human mind has an idea of such an intellect, and ideas about how being is generated and completely determined. And these are the transcendental ideas, as Kant calls them. These can be thought, but they cannot be known. Such ideas regulate the procedure by which the human mind overcomes its metaphysical ignorance, the procedure of applying concepts to intuitions. For the human mind is not like an infinite intellect, which would produce its objects in thinking them. The human mind can only think, and it must apply its stock of concepts to given things that affect it from the outside. Pure a priori concepts, Kant's categories, neither generate beings nor internally determine them to be what they are. The categories are applied externally to the given, determining it as an object in general that can be represented and known. Determination is a matter of applying to intuitive material the concepts which make it an object of possible experience. The genesis and internal determination of that material are inaccessible to us, and, in Kant's phrase, they must remain undetermined. So Deleuze criticizes transcendental idealism on the grounds that in separating thought and being in this way, it blocks every attempt to investigate the genesis of being. In fact, that is very explicitly Kant's aim, to block that attempt. Deleuze is critical of Kant's so-called empiricism in considering structures of thought only as they are applied externally to received givens. Neither the concept nor the idea has any internal connection to being. Kant's transcendental idealism is not transcendental enough for Deleuze because it cannot show how the structures of thought are really and internally connected to the given, nor how thinking can apply itself to anything other than its own representations. Thinking, trapped among its concepts, is fundamentally at odds with the being whose means of production it cannot know. The transcendental aesthetic, the science of the sensible, becomes founded on what can be represented in the sensible and not on the being of the sensible. For Kant, the concept is applied to the intuition from the outside, such that the transcendental moment is one of conditioning, and the requirement to account for the genesis of the given is renounced. The determination of things through concepts is a process external to those things that relies on mere empirical differences. These differences enable us to determine things relative to one another, or negatively, but they do not account for how they are positively determined in the first place. Through their external differences, things differ merely in degree, because they all resemble each other at some level of generality. Kant's categories are the terms of highest generality that render objects of experience the same in their objectivity in general, but different in their degree of spatial extent, their temporal duration, their qualitative intensity, their causal efficacy, and so on. The determination of the given takes place through applying the terms of highest generality to it from the outside. It is in this sense that the mistake of empiricism is to leave external what is separated, in Deleuze's phrase, while the mistake of dogmatism is to fill it. Dogmatism fills the gap between a determinable object and its conceptual determination, either by arguing for the a priori complete determination of the former by the latter, that would be Leibnizian rationalism, or by showing that they necessarily collapse into a new indeterminate unity, that would be Hegelian idealism. But empiricism leaves the determinable object and its conceptual determination separate, such that the determinable-determinant relation is external to the thing to be determined. A more profound transcendental philosophy must consider how determination and the crucial relation between determinable and determinant operates internally to the thing, such that the determination of the thing is no broader than the thing itself. Externally determining conditions will only give us objects in general that differ in degree and the mass of possible experience. Kant's approach is too empirical, investigating merely the superficial relation of concepts to representations and never delving into the depth of what makes those representations what they are. So Deleuze's transcendental empiricism is worked out in contrast to this. It is concerned with what is immanent to the empirical, the transcendental conditions that generate the real, and the real here is understood in the Kantian sense of that which is qualitative or intensive, that which can only be sensed and which cannot be known a priori. In seeking what lies within and gives rise to real experience, Deleuze wants to recover a more determinate version of Kant's noumenon, one that does not have a transcendent relation to phenomena. He seeks the noumenon closest to the phenomenon, which is internal to it and produces it immanently. Whereas Kant's noumenon is the indeterminate thought of an intelligible ground, Deleuze's is the being of the sensible, which is both determinable and determining, and which can only be sensed or encountered, not represented. The object of encounter, which forces us to think, is not a sensible being, but the being of the sensible. It is not the given, but that by which the given is given. It's a well-known quote from Deleuze's Difference in Repetition. The sensible is Kant's empirically real world of possible experience, whereas the encounter is the real of sensation, just that element which cannot be anticipated. The encounter is forced into the sensible realm by intensity, a real, but not empirically real, transcendental condition, but not a condition of possible experience. Intensity is insensible in terms of representation, and it's unthinkable in terms of concepts. But the fact that it cannot be grasped by the empirical exercise of the faculties of common sense does not render it unintelligible. Rather, the intensive condition of the given is internal to thought and must be thought. This is not conceptual thought applied to an already given object. It is the thought that is forced on us in the encounter, in the giving of the given. Deleuze makes the Kantian real of sensation the product of a genesis immanent to thought. For Deleuze, drawing on the thought of Solomon Maimon, the real transcendental condition of the given are ideas, within which intensities flow and surge. Kant also locates the conditions of the given in ideas. Ideas, of course, for him, are thoughts of what produces and completely determines being, and these are the transcendental ideas of the infinite intellect and the sum total of reality. These ideas are conditions that cannot be experienced, but that force themselves upon our thought. But while Kant's ideas can legitimately be thought as the conditions of our thinking of the genesis of being, they cannot be assumed to be the real conditions of that genesis. And furthermore, transcendental ideas are legitimate only when they regulate conceptual thought. For Kant, attempting to investigate the genetic conditions of being brings us to transcendental ideas, whose explanatory power is limited to the realm of concepts of possible experience. Once again, we're closed off from the conditions of the real of sensation. Kant's transcendental ideas are important but ultimately frustrating for Deleuze. They are problems concerning the genesis of being, expressed in the paralogisms, antinomies, and ideal of pure reason. But these problems are solved only in relation to represented appearances and concepts of understanding. Problems that cannot be solved in relation to these external conditions are false problems that generate transcendent objects as their illusory solutions. The antinomies, for instance, are insoluble if we assume their ideas relate to the real being of a complete universe, a first cause, and so on. They are resolved only when their ideas are restricted to regulating our thinking about possible experience. Deleuze thinks this makes the truth of the Kantian idea dependent on the possibility of finding a solution in its external relation to representation and not on its internal power. The constitutive power of the idea to determine and generate being is distrusted and suppressed by Kant, leaving it only a regulative power to determine thinking. It is not that transcendental idealism is unwilling to investigate the conditions of being in the idea, Deleuze thinks, rather it is unable to do so, for it cannot trust the power of ideas except insofar as they are considered not to be constitutive of being. So, Deleuze's criticism that Kant's transcendental idealism is too empirical has 4 targets. First, Kant's failure to account for the genesis of beings. Second, his external account of determination. Third, his reliance on a conception of difference in degree. And fourth, his denial that the idea has any real constitutive power. Deleuze's transcendental empiricism is proposed as a corrective to those limitations. It looks into the depth, interior, or being of experience and does not remain on its surface. Deleuze wants to find there a concept of difference in itself, where differences in kind affirmatively determine and individuate things, and ideas are the internally determining conditions that produce intensive real objects that differ in kind. Difference must be internal to determination, which takes place between determinable and determinant elements in the idea. The relation will then not be one of externally conditioning the object of experience, but of internally generating and determining the real object without relying on an infinite intellect. Okay, we're now going to move into the second section, which is a little bit more difficult, a little bit more detailed on Kant's philosophy. So I'll try to go as slowly as is reasonable. Now, Deleuze's critique of Kant, as I've just summarized it, risks the objection that it misses the point. Because Kant's intention is precisely to establish the external determination of judgment in the place of the internal ontological determination of rationalism. So this is exactly what Kant sets out to do. He wants to get rid of the internal determination that you get with thinkers like Leibniz and to replace it with the kind of determination that you get with the epistemological judgment. So what makes Deleuze a significant reader of Kant is not, in fact, the critique of Kant that I've just summarized, which is actually where most readers of Deleuze on Kant tend to stop. They just say, well, Deleuze just criticizes Kant for being too external. Well, yes, he does, but that's actually not very interesting. What's interesting about Deleuze's reading of Kant is actually his insistence that Kant does thematize a kind of internal determination in a way that avoids dogmatism and that actually approaches his own transcendental empiricism. And this is what I'm going to look at in this section. Now, if you look at the second quote on your handout, that's what I'm going to read next. In chapter 1 of Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says, rather than being concerned with what happens before and after Kant, which amounts to the same thing, we should be concerned with a precise moment within Kantianism, a furtive and explosive moment which is not even continued by Kant, much less by post-Kantianism. For when Kant puts rational theology into question, in the same stroke he introduces a kind of disequilibrium, a fissure or crack in the pure self of the I think, an alienation in principle, insurmountable in principle. Now, Kant puts rational theology into question by making God a regulative idea. God no longer has the power to think the sum total of reality, nor to generate or determine the being of the world internally in his own thought. Instead, for Kant, the subject has the power to think the idea of God and to determine objects externally using the categories. The subject has this power thanks to its spontaneity, the active part of the subject that applies concepts to the objects that are given to it and that are taken up by the subject's receptivity. So in asserting the spontaneity of the subject, Kant thereby puts rational theology into question. And he gives the power of internal determination, in a sense, to the subject. So the moment in question that Deleuze is pointing to is one that makes the spontaneous self an other to itself. And this happens in section 25 of the B edition of Kant's Transcendental Deduction. Here, the difference between the given and the concept that grounds the external determination of possible experience actually reveals a more profound difference between being and thinking that grounds the internal determination of the real. So let's go through this more slowly now. The transcendental deduction is, as everyone will know who's read a little bit of Kant, where Kant justifies the application of categories to the given. It's also probably the most difficult part of Kant's critique of pure reason, and a part that, believe me, doesn't get any easier as you've read it for the 150th time. It seems different every time you read it somehow. Now he does this, he justifies the application of categories to the given by way of an analysis of the complex moves through which experience, and both the subject and the object of experience, are formed. The sections under consideration here concern how the manifold of intuition, including intuition of our own existence, is synthesized and thereby determined by our spontaneous understanding. In section 24, Kant shows that inner sense on its own contains only the form of intuition without a combined manifold, and therefore it contains no determinate intuition. The understanding, through the spontaneous act that relates the manifold to the I think, combines the manifold and thereby determines it. So you have this spontaneous understanding, it sort of combines what it takes in from the world, the manifold, the manyfoldedness of intuition, and it determines it through its own thinking process. In this way, indeterminate intuitions are produced as determinate representations that can be thought. So this is a process by which the mind transforms the indeterminate stuff of the world into something which is suitable for thinking. Now, even time, which is the pure form of inner sense, even time cannot be represented or determined or thought unless that manifold is combined. So for instance, in the drawing of a line. So even things that are kind of already eternal to our minds can't actually be made suitable for thought unless we do this activity of combining the manifold. And Kant says that when we draw a line, that's us kind of creating time as a manifold. When you draw a line, that's pure temporality just sort of exhibited in front of you. The self, insofar as it is intuited in inner sense, that is our own access to our own selves, is equally indeterminate unless its manifold is similarly combined by the understanding. The indeterminate self and the self that determines it, because remember there's a self that's doing the determining as well as a self which has to be determined, these two things are the same subject and yet they are distinct. But there's no difficulty here, Kant says. Since I am an appearance in space and time, like anything else, I must be given to my own passive receptivity and synthesized by my own active spontaneity, just like any other object. So I need to become an object to myself, which is intuited in the world and given to myself for thinking. Now, the complexity with this situation is drawn out in the crucial section 25. In the activity of combining the manifold, Kant says, I am conscious of myself, not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am. This representation is a thought, not an intuition. That is, the I think, which is responsible for determining the intuitions, involves the indeterminate thought of my own existence. My existence is not immediately determined by the I think, for it can be determined only through a combination of the manifold of inner sense. The consciousness of my existence that arises with the I think gives me no knowledge of my existence. Accordingly, Kant says, I have no knowledge of myself as I am, but merely as I appear to myself. Now, Deleuze rightly points out that this is Kant's response to Descartes' cogito, which states that determination, or the I think, directly implies an undetermined existence, the I am, which is determinable by it. In other words, I am a thing that thinks is the phrase that the cogito ergo sum is the phrase that sums that up. And here we have quote 3 on your handout. The entire Kantian critique, says Deleuze, amounts to objecting against Descartes that it is impossible for determination to bear directly upon the undetermined. The determination, I think, obviously implies something undetermined, I am, but nothing so far tells us how it is that this undetermined is determinable by the I think. Kant therefore adds a third logical value, the determinable, or rather, the form in which the undetermined is determinable by the determination. This third value suffices to make logic a transcendental instance. It amounts to the discovery of difference, no longer in the form of an empirical difference between two determinations, but in the form of a transcendental difference between the determination as such and what it determines. No longer in the form of an external difference which separates, but in the form of an internal difference which establishes an a priori relation between thought and being. In Kant's rejection of the immediacy of I think, therefore I am, Deleuze finds that Kant adopts transcendental empiricism, just for an instant, and discovers the pure difference internal to the relation of determination. This difference establishes an original relation between thought and being that is deeper than that criticized relation between concept and given. To understand Deleuze's point, we need to look at Kant's important footnote, section 25. So we're really getting into the detail here. Kant reiterates there that while my existence is already given with the I think that determines it, my existence cannot be immediately determined. So that's the baseline that we're starting from here. We have this spontaneous thinking capacity in our subjectivity. Obviously, there's some existence that's implied by that, but the point is that that existence is purely indeterminate. It cannot be determined by the I think because it hasn't yet provided a manifold that's synthesizable. Okay. For the mode in which I am to determine my existence, that is, the manifold that is to be combined by the I think, is not immediately given. So this is the problem. The pure existence of my own thinking self doesn't appear to me as a manifold because it's purely in the act of actually doing the thinking. That manifold of the self needs to be intuited in time, which makes my indeterminate existence determinable by the I think. So in order for there to be a manifold that I can turn into a suitable subject matter for my own thinking, I need to somehow make it into something temporal. I need to make it into something which can be sort of run through by my thinking process, even though what I'm determining is the thinking process that's actually doing the determining. Okay, so what happens then is that the I think thereby determines something which is actually different from itself. It's made its own being something different from itself because it determines its existence as it is given in time. Thus, Kant says, this is quote number 4, I cannot determine my existence as that of a self-active being. All that I can do is to represent to myself the spontaneity of my thought, that is, of the determination. So just to make sure that this point is clear, because this is very difficult, the point is that the being of one's own spontaneity, one's own thinking, cannot be thought. It's something which simply is not amenable to thought, because in Kant's view, in order for something to be suitable for thought, it has to be run through as a manifold, and that means it has to be made determinable. It has to have an ingredient added to it which makes it suitable for determination. And that ingredient is time. It has to be made temporal. But once you add time to this pure being of the self, it turns into something different. It's no longer that pure being of the thinking self. It's actually become something else. So Kant concludes, I cannot determine my own existence as that of a self-active being. All that I can do is to represent to myself the spontaneity of my thought, that is, of the determination. So the I think, in the act of determining its existence, actually prevents the determination of its own activity. And so the determination of my existence is a movement of self-differing. Determination is not here a matter of subsuming some given being in general under some external concept that would determine it as my being. Instead, it is a matter of producing my being by internally differentiating it from my thinking. So the process one needs to go through, Kant says, is that you take your own thinking and you actually have to produce difference in it in order to make it thinkable. This is the moment in which Kant approaches a theory of immanent differential genesis. The I think generates itself from its own differential relation to itself. The difference means there is no possibility of adequately thinking my spontaneity. It can only be represented insofar as receptivity experiences the spontaneity of my thought being exercised upon it as if from the outside. The self cannot enact or be its own thinking activity. For this reason, Deleuze characterizes this moment with Rimbaud's phrase, "I is another," which he quotes many times in relation to Kant. Time is the condition of determinability of the self and the hinge on which I generate my difference from myself. I cannot experience or know the spontaneity of my thought. I can only experience its effects in time. So Deleuze calls this Kant's fractured I, and this grounds determination in an original difference of undetermined being and determinant thinking. The fractured I is undetermined being, the determinability of that being, and the activity of determining it. It kind of synthesizes all three of those phases. In this sense, it has the same problematic unity as the idea in Deleuze's sense. So Deleuze uses this term idea, which he takes partly from Kant, partly from Maimon, and actually it turns out that Deleuze's sense of the idea repeats the same kind of tripartite unity that you get in the fractured I in Kant. So here's quote number 5. Ideas present three moments, Deleuze says. Undetermined with regard to their object, determinable with regard to objects of experience, and bearing the ideal of an infinite determination with regard to concepts of the understanding. It is apparent that ideas here repeat the three aspects of the fractured cogito. The I am as an indeterminate existence, time as the form under which this existence is determinable, and the I think as a determination. Ideas are exactly the thoughts of the cogito, the differentials of thought. So this passage suggests that Deleuze's idea has its roots not only in Kant's transcendental ideas, but also in the fractured I. The spontaneous activity of Kant's fractured I remains undetermined as it determines its being, thereby producing itself as that which can only be represented as another. Correspondingly, Deleuze's idea, in its activity of determining itself with regard to objects of experience, remains undetermined with regard to its object. The object of the idea is the virtual problem, and its self-determination is its integration into actual solutions. As the idea determines itself through actual solutions in the realm of the sensible, its virtual object, the problem, must be represented without being able to be directly determined. The problem becomes determined by analogy with the objects of experience it relates to. So the idea is its differing from itself. It produces itself as the determinate solutions that make its problematic being fundamentally undeterminable and thinkable only in terms of representation. As a result, problems can be represented in terms of experience and concepts through, though the problematic being of the idea is fundamentally undetermined and unrepresentable. Just as Kant's passive self receives the activity of its own thought as another, Deleuze's actualized idea receives the activity of the problem as another. This other has a powerful capacity to shock. It is the being of the sensible that can only be sensed, the unthinkable that must be thought. So Deleuze's idea, like the fractured I, indicates the priority of time in the determination and genesis of real experience. Ideas are the thoughts of the fractured cogito because they enact the activity of thinking determining its being as the unfolding of time. Time is the form of the determinability of being by thought. For Kant, it is the form internal to the I that continually produces the I as differing from itself. So time is that form that actually does the producing, if you like. For Deleuze, time is internal to the idea. Its unfolding is the activity of the idea determining itself and preserving its own indeterminacy. Time is understood here as the pure difference that establishes the a priori relation between thinking and being. It is not that thinking determines being in time, as if thinking and being were concept and object, standing opposed to one another in a temporal container. Rather, time is the difference internal to both the fractured I and the idea. Thought determining being is the unfolding of time and the operation of difference. This indicates an original and irreducible relation that does not merely condition but generates experience. The relation of the difference of thinking and being that can be formulated thinking, time, being, or determinant, determinable, undetermined. Ideas, Deleuze says, contain these dismembered moments as an internal, problematic, objective unity. So it's clear that this determination does not take the form of a judgment between concept and object, and that the thinking and being spoken of here do not refer to a subjective mind or to actual objects. Rather, this is a deeper ontological relation that forms the internal structure of Deleuze's virtual, pre-individual idea and Kant's pre-subjective I. The original relation of the determination and genesis of the real is the relation of being and thinking differentiated by time. Deleuze thinks Kant is wrong to locate this differential relation in a subject where the difference and its generative power quickly become covered over. The fracture in the I is, he says, quickly filled by a new form of identity and obscured by the external difference between spontaneity and receptivity. Yet in this moment of the transcendental deduction, which even the post-Kantians do not recognize, Kant discovers pure difference. The fractured, self-differing I is, for Deleuze, the essence of Kant's Copernican revolution and constitutes the discovery of the transcendental. For here, Kant discovers the genetic condition of real experience in the pure difference of being and thinking. In this, Kant overcomes rationalism. For without this difference, experience and determination would be grounded in the identity of an infinite intellect for which there is no being that cannot be thought. Actual experience would be nothing more than a copy of a possible reality determined in advance. Both the content of experience and the space in which it plays out would be predetermined, and the future would be foreseeable. Where experience is grounded in the pure difference between being and thinking, however, either in Kant's fractured I or in Deleuze's idea, the sensible is determined as it is generated. Experience is produced as surprising and unforeseeable. From pure difference emerge the real encounters that cannot be anticipated and that shock us into thinking. Okay, so we now move to the third section and the final section, and this kind of moves out of that pit that we've just been in, and we talk in slightly more general terms. Kant's Copernican revolution rests on the discovery of this internal difference, but also on the transcendent subject that covers it over. Kant both reveals and conceals that experience is transcendentally conditioned by pure determining difference. This tension between revealing and concealing is intrinsic to transcendental idealism. The concealing move of conceptual judgment is necessarily grounded in the fractured I. But the internal difference of the self cannot remain openly revealed, lest the whole critical enterprise collapse in on itself. Kantian critique requires a self-identical subject that can reliably think about itself and its projects. The subject, in order to be a subject, necessarily conceals the differential conditions of its own genesis. No wonder then that Kant cannot or will not inquire into the genetic conditions of the real. This interplay of revealing and concealing amounts to the Kantian plane of immanence, and that's what I'm going to briefly discuss in this last section. Now, immanence and the transcendental are rather neatly conjoined for Kant. People may not be aware that immanence actually is a term that Kant uses quite a lot. Things that appear to us have conditions of possibility that are transcendental but not transcendent for Kant. And this means that the principles that serve as transcendental conditions and our search for and use of those principles are immanent in Kant's sense. What that means is that they remain within the bounds of possible experience. This is what Kant means by the term immanent. He doesn't mean the same as what Deleuze means or what Spinoza means, but he does mean something by immanent, and he means things that remain within the bounds of possible experience. Principles that profess to pass beyond those bounds are transcendent, and they generate transcendental illusions. So for Kant, concepts and representations are immanent as long as they apply only to objects of possible experience, and ideas are used immanently as long as they only regulate and determine thinking. The act of externally determining givens through concepts is immanent, but an attempt to account for their genesis would not be. So this sense of immanence is almost the opposite of Deleuze's sense of immanence. And yet, the notion of the plane of immanence, as you find it in Deleuze and Guattari, is a partly Kantian idea, and it's discussed in What is Philosophy in Kantian terms. When they distinguish the plane from the concept, Deleuze and Guattari state, this is quote 6, the plane of immanence is not a concept that is or can be thought, but rather the image of thought. The image thought gives itself of what it means to think, to make use of thought, to find one's bearings in thought. And this quote is very well known. It's the one place where Deleuze and Guattari seem to define the plane of immanence, although it's something that can't really be defined, so it's a problematic kind of notion. Now, this quote actually refers to Kant's essay, What is Orientation in Thinking? An essay written in 1786, in which Kant stresses the importance of recognizing reason's limits. Kant draws an analogy between spatial and logical orientation. We orient ourselves in an unfamiliar landscape or room by relating fixed objects to the difference we feel within our own subject between left and right. We similarly orient ourselves in thought by means of a subjective principle of reason where objective principles of reason are inadequate. When reason ventures beyond the frontiers of possible experience, it too orients itself by means of a subjective feeling. In this case, its own need for a concept of an unconditioned being to ground the concept of possible experience as a whole. Instead of left and right, reason makes use of a distinction between its own theoretical and practical employment, which determines whether an object is a matter of knowledge or whether it's an object of mere rational belief. With the understanding that God is a matter only of rational belief, the thinker has a compass with which to orient himself on his rational wanderings beyond possible experience. So, Kant's image of what it means to find one's bearings in thought is decidedly spatial and geographical. It's the image of reason wandering in a field, crossing the boundary line of possible experience into the dark and unfamiliar land of the supersensible, orienting itself by means of its need for the unconditioned and the internal compass that tells it how to reflect upon it. Put otherwise, reason gives the orders as to what is immanent and includable in conceptual thought and what is transcendent and excluded. So this is the Kantian plane of immanence. The image thought gives itself of what it means to think. Thinking means excluding that which cannot be thought in representational and conceptual terms. These excluded things can be thought. They are ideas, after all, but they are objects of mere speculation and symbolization. Every element of the plane is in the subject. The subject constitutes the field, the conditions of what appears inside the boundary line, where the boundary line is drawn, the need to venture beyond it, and the tools for orientation. For Kant, all of that is internal to the subject. Danger, too, comes from the subject. Thought is threatened by the illusions that issue from reason itself. Kant's assumption that reason can identify and assess its own conditions, its own structures, and its own errors is, of course, known as immanent critique. The assumption that reason can orient itself without reference to anything outside it. So the Kantian plane is an image of immanence as the transcendental. This plane is constituted by the subject as the condition of possibility of all cognitive thinking as such. Kant called his plane transcendental philosophy, and he believed that he had thereby avoided transcendence and illusion. But by making the plane immanent to a subject, Kant, in Deleuze's words, discovers the modern way of saving transcendence, the transcendence of a subject to which the field of immanence is only attributed by belonging to a self that necessarily represents such a subject to itself. What the subject transcends is the unthinkable, which is either made thinkable through synthesis and judgment, or is simply pushed off the plane. In affirming itself as the center and legislator of immanence, in deciding what is to stay inside conceptual thought and what outside, reason actually creates an outside to which it itself is transcendent. Yet there is another outside at work here. The best plane of immanence that Deleuze and Guattari discuss, perhaps discovered only by Spinoza in Deleuze's view, is one in which immanence is not immanent to anything, transcendence is not restored, and the unthinkable outside of thought is not external to thought itself. The same idea is expressed in this well-known quote from Deleuze's essay, Immanence, a Life. This is quote 7. Without consciousness, the transcendental field would be defined as a pure plane of immanence, since it escapes every transcendence of the subject as well as of the object. Absolute immanence is in itself. It is not in something, not to something. It does not depend on an object and does not belong to a subject. In Kant, immanence is deformed and ends up being contained in the transcendent. Immanence does not relate to a something that is a unity superior to everything, nor to a subject that is an act operating the synthesis of things. It is when immanence is no longer immanence to anything other than itself that we can talk of a plane of immanence. Just as Deleuze criticizes Kant's suppression of difference, he criticizes Kant for deforming immanence and containing it within a transcendent subject. But equally, just as the suppression of difference conceals an original discovery of internal difference in the fractured I, the subjection of immanence conceals the unthinkable at the heart of conceptual thought. Deep within the transcendent subject, indeed immanent to it, is the impossibility of thought thinking its own being. This unthinkable is not an idea to be cordoned off by reason into the realm of rational belief. It is an unthinkable that originates all conceptual thought, that must be thought if representation and concepts are to get off the ground in the first place. So Kant's plane of immanence reveals and conceals the plane of immanence, the one that, in quote 8, is at the same time that which must be thought and that which cannot be thought. It is the non-thought within thought. It is the base of all planes, immanent to every thinkable plane that does not succeed in thinking it. It is the most intimate within thought and yet the absolute outside. An outside more distant than any external world because it is an inside deeper than any internal world. It is immanence, the incessant toing and froing of the plane, infinite movement. In this toing and froing is the rhythm of revealing and concealing. The non-thought within thought, the very being of thought, is precisely what Kant finds at the heart of the transcendental, which cannot represent or conceptualize this being and so does not succeed in thinking it. The unthinkable is revealed in the process of the self analyzing its own conditions, that process of immanent critique. But it must necessarily be concealed in order for critique by a self to be possible at all. The condition of possibility of critique is that the being of thought, that which cannot be thought, must be concealed in order to be revealed, and vice versa. And Kant's critical philosophy itself rests on this paradox. I suggest that Deleuze's own conception of what philosophy is related to this revealing, concealing structure at the heart of Kant's critical philosophy. The condition of possibility of philosophy is something that cannot be thought and must be thought, something non-philosophical that comes from the outside. The non-philosophical is revealed in the shock of the encounter and cannot be accommodated to representation or conceptualization. Thought can only give itself an image of what it means to think, an image of what it is to be affected by the unthinkable. For this reason, the supreme act of philosophy is not to think the plane of immanence, but to show in an image that it is there. Philosophical showing reveals that which cannot be thought and yet must be thought. But this act of showing and thinking the unthinkable is surely also a concealment of the unthinkable spur to thought. Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy shows us what philosophy is by playing out the impossibility and the exigency of thinking its own unthinkable sources. Kant's critique of pure reason similarly shows us what philosophy is in a Deleuzean sense. This is also what philosophy is in a Kantian sense, asking into the conditions of possibility of thinking as such. Kant and Deleuze mutually illuminate each other's thought through their shared commitment to the unthought that generates thought. And for this reason, Kant is crucial for understanding Deleuze, and Deleuze is a significant interpreter of Kant. Thank you for your attention. That's it. We're done. Kant's critique of pure reason aims, among other things, to destabilize the rationalist assumption that thought is necessarily adequate to being. For the rationalist, to be is to be conceived in a complete concept by God's infinite intellect, and to be thus conceived is to be brought into being. Rationalism thereby provides a unified account of the genesis of beings, and, at the same time, of their determination to be what they specifically are. Now, fundamental to Kant's transcendental idealism, by contrast, is the denial of the intelligibility of the genesis and complete determination of beings. That is what Kant's project is all about, to say that that process is simply not intelligible to the human mind. The finite thought of human minds are not only inadequate to being, they cannot even be certain that there is an infinite intellect that would generate, determine, and know being adequately. The human mind has an idea of such an intellect, and ideas about how being is generated and completely determined. And these are the transcendental ideas, as Kant calls them. These can be thought, but they cannot be known. Such ideas regulate the procedure by which the human mind overcomes its metaphysical ignorance. The procedure trying to reveal the same mystery. So in this paper, I'm going to show how Deleuze upholds Kant's recognition of the difference of being and thought as an internally determining and ontologically productive difference. It is because of this discovery that Deleuze criticizes Kant's tendency to conceal difference and to make determination an external, merely epistemic procedure. Kant discovers the differing of thought from its own being, but covers over this internal difference with the identity of the subject, leading him to affirm only the external separation of conceptual thought from the being of the given. So a pure, productive internal difference is suppressed in favor of a restrictive external separation reliant on a self-identical subject. So in the first section, we're going to look at Kant's repression of difference and Deleuze's criticism of it. In the second section, the more difficult one, we're going to look in more detail at Kant's discovery of the difference of being and thought and what Deleuze finds productive in it. And in the third section, we'll return to what is philosophy to see how Deleuze connects this difference to his thinking of the plane of immanence and what philosophy is. So, the first section begins now. Plane, and to think it in this way as the outside and inside of thought, as the not external outside and the not internal inside, that which cannot be thought and yet must be thought, which was thought once, as Christ was incarnated once, in order to show that one time the possibility of the impossible. Thus, Spinoza is the Christ of philosophers, and the greatest philosophers are hardly more than apostles who distance themselves from or draw near to this mystery. So Deleuze appears here as an apostle among apostles, attempting to draw ever nearer to the mystery of thought that thinks its own being. This activity both makes possible and relies on the difference of being and thought. Thought generates its own differing from itself, its own unthought or outside, that is nevertheless internal to it, as if thought was worked over from the inside by something it cannot think, to quote another of Deleuze's texts. With respect to the discovery of this specific problem, that is, the problem of how thought is to think its own being, Kant is second only to Spinoza in Deleuze's estimation. And this means we can't reduce the relationship between Deleuze and Kant to one of mere rivalry or criticism, but we should instead see Kant as Deleuze's co-apostle. Yeah, so this is a paper in 3 parts, and the 3 parts kind of go like this. The first part is sort of reasonably comprehensible on a fairly normal level, and then we go down into some very kind of deep and complex material, and then we kind of come out again and we return to the level of reasonably comprehensible. So that's how it'll go. I'll signal how we're doing with those 3 parts, and I'll try to sort of go as slowly as possible on the bits that are more difficult, which kind of involve going into some detail of Kant's philosophy, which for some people may not be familiar. So, Kant's answer to the question of determination, which is the question of how things are determined to be what they are, defines transcendental idealism and forms the core of Deleuze's lifelong fascination with Kant. Deleuze criticizes Kant for reducing determination to the external application of concepts to the given. But what really preoccupies Deleuze is a deeper account of determination in Kant, the determination of the being of the self by its own thinking activity. Our own determinable being is precisely what is to be thought, that is, what is to be determined, but it is not thought, and it cannot be thought, since the only thing that can be thought is the being that is determined. I am going to go over that in more detail later on. The 2 elements here are made different by the time it takes to do the determining. And what fascinates Deleuze about Kant is that the very act in which the I thinks its own being requires that being to squirm out of thought's reach. Through its thinking activity, the I generates difference from its being, indicating that the being of thought is both what must be thought and what cannot be thought. So the difference of thought from its being recurs throughout Deleuze's writings on Kant. The significance of this motif can be seen in the first quote on your handout, which is from What is Philosophy?, where Deleuze links this attempt to think the being of thought with thinking the plane of immanence. So he says, perhaps this is the supreme act of philosophy, not so much to think the plane of immanence as to show that it is there, unthought in every